Hi, everyone. Purpose of this lecture is to give a very broad overview of the development of Japanese food history from the ancient to the medieval period. Specifically, what I want to do today, if I can advance the slide, is to ask what are the key developments in food history from ancient to medieval times in Japan. I'll begin with a chronological overview of these historical periods, have some references to taboos and rituals, which are really important for understanding where Japanese cuisine comes from. Lots of ways to define cuisine, and the way I define it is when food becomes something else, when it takes on different meanings, religious meanings, metaphorical meanings, references to the seasons, all sorts of things. And that happens, I think, initially in Japan through rituals and taboos. And so I'll mention a few of those and see later in point four how these gave rise to a cuisine. Point three, I'm going to look at the diets of medieval samurai, monks, and peasants to draw some comparisons and understand how these different social classes ate and what they ate. So that's the plan, and let's move forward. First of all, our chronology. I'm not going to cover the early modern period. I'm going to make reference to it today, but I'm going to devote another lecture to early modern Japan. So the three periods I'm really going to focus on are the prehistoric, the ancient, and the medieval. And prehistoric is literally a time before history. Yes, okay, there are some Chinese references to the third century in Japan, but the Japanese are not consistently writing their own written sources in this period. And so that's why it's called the prehistoric period. Another thing that people might fuss about is the dating of these periods. I'm using traditional dating for the Jomon and the Yayoi period, which uh, sees 400 BCE as a sort of turning point. Nowadays, though, many scholars push back the beginning of Yayoi to the second millennia BCE or the first millennia BCE. And, it's more a process than a moment. Why Yayoi happened is it's marked by the arrival of agriculture and technologies like bronze and iron. And those didn't happen in one moment. Those happened in stages and happened in different parts of Japan. So just for simplicity's sake, we'll say 400 BCE, but realize that we should probably have that in air quotes, that it's a little more vague than that. So prehistoric periods are the Jomon period, the Yayoi, and the Colossal Tomb, or the Kofun period. Then we move into the ancient period, the Nara and the Heian period. And again, some people might quibble and say, well, Heian's really medieval. But for the purposes of this lecture, let's just call it let's just call it ancient, okay? Please. And then we'll say more about the medieval periods and early modern a little bit later on. So, just broadly speaking, I wanted to put out some trends here in this slide, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about them in subsequent slides. But here they are all laid out for us in ancient, medieval, and early modern. And basically, what are the staples in the medieval or ancient and early modern periods? Well, in the ancient period, we see references to the five grains. And so, in other words, we have to stop and think, well, didn't the Japanese just eat rice? Actually, no. Rice was only 25% of the diet up until the early modern period. Actually, there are other grains that are important. Some of these aren't even grains. And then there are gathered foods like nuts that are probably a really major part of the diet. And those include edible nuts like chestnuts, but also things like acorns that had to be processed. There are root vegetables like taro that are consumed in the ancient period. In the medieval period, buckwheat and wheat are more widely consumed, and that's due to the arrival of stone mortars. Yes, people are growing wheat and buckwheat in the ancient period, but they usually used to feed horses because it takes effort and time to process these foods, and they didn't really have the technology to do that very well until the medieval period when stone mortars arrive. And that's when you see udon and soba, wheat and buckwheat noodles. It's in medieval Japan. Early modern period, new foods arrive. There's sweet potatoes and white potatoes and corn. Depending on what part of Japan you lived in the early modern period, your corn might be your staple if you're living in the mountains of Shikoku, for example. And people are eating milled grains, referencing the wheat and the buckwheat. Those really take off as foodstuffs in the early modern period. How are people cooking? Well, in terms of cooking your grain, you're going to use a steamer in the ancient period, and I'll talk more about that. Chopsticks arrive in the ancient period. Medieval period, pots get a little bit better. They're metal pots, and boiling the rice is more predominant. Stone mortars arrive, as I mentioned, and agriculture. We'll see how that improves in the medieval period. And that has a huge impact, not just on food, but on sake, because now you have more rice that you can not just eat, but turn into a beverage. Finally, in terms of cooking technology in the early modern period, stoves develop. And these are not ovens, but stoves. And I'll explain the difference in just a moment. Cooking the grains, you probably in the ancient period going to be making sticky brown rice if you're using a steamer. And it's going to be brown because you're just going to be dehulling the rice. It's not going to be polished at all. Polishing takes a lot of effort. And it's not until the early modern period that that becomes much easier. From the 17th century on, there are rice polishing shops in the major cities, and that's when you can get a hold of white rice. In the medieval period, you have your cooking pots and you can make a rice porridge. In terms of other cooking techniques for serving food, raw, dried, pickling, grilling, and steaming are all ancient techniques that endured throughout time. Simmered foods, now that you have your better cooking pots, more simmered foods in the medieval period. And the trend is to serve foods warmer, although not always, not always in every circumstance. Frying and fast foods like sushi debut in the early modern period. How about flavorings? Well, the Japanese word for flavoring literally is anbai, and the literal meaning of that is salt and plum. And by plum, it's actually meaning apricot, pickled apricot. Now my cat wants to say something. Oh, well, we'll just talk over her. So, salt and plums. Other types of medieval flavoring, there's one called hishio, which could be a fish sauce or it could be a prototype of soy sauce, in that there are recipes that indicate it's very similarly put together as soy sauce. You have soybeans, water, sake, wheat, probably koji, but we're not so certain about that. And I'll talk about koji a little bit later. Miso is the dominant flavoring of the medieval period and actually into the early modern period too. Soy sauce really doesn't take off until the early modern period. So if people are eating sashimi, for example, in the medieval period, they're using vinegar and not soy sauce. Sugar also becomes more prominent in the early modern period as the Portuguese reintroduce the Japanese to it and how to use it. And just as one cultural reference can refer to Buddhism arriving in 552. And that's, again, the traditional date, when in fact Buddhism probably arrives in waves. And certainly in the Nara period in the 8th century, it becomes a state religion. Saying Buddhism, but very quickly, Buddhism becomes amalgamated with Shinto. And from the perspective of people living in pre-modern Japan, they're really two sides of the same coin. They didn't think of them as being so separate. So a Shinto deity could be a Buddhist figure. Buddhism becomes more widely popularized in the medieval period, and the early modern period sees a brief introduction of Christianity, but that has to go underground as the warrior government tries its best to stamp it out in the 17th century, and Buddhism endures. So, a broad overview. I want to talk about some of these topics in more detail right now. First of all, the five grains. So these are the staple foods that people are eating. But whoa, wait a second. We have to also say they're not the complete staple foods, because chances are people are eating, even up to the 20th century, lots of nuts that are gathered. So chestnuts and even things like acorns and horse chestnuts that have to be processed before consumption. So, what are these five grains? Well, it could include rice, barley, barnyard millet, ordinary millets, foxtail millet, and soybeans. And the slide shows two different types of millet. So it could include rice. It could include all these things. There's lots of different definitions of the five grains. And what I find interesting is that soybeans are considered a grain. I guess what they mean here by five grains are sort of the five key staple foods. Besides soybeans, adzuki beans, those red beans that are used in confectionery, those are important foodstuffs from the ancient period onward. They might be included in rice, for example, or cooked separately. Wheat and buckwheat, those are known in the ancient period, but as I said before, they're not widely consumed until the medieval period. And actually, it's more of or these are more early modern foods when we think of udon and soba. And speaking of early modern foods, corn, sweet potatoes, and white potatoes arrive in the early modern period. So it's a lot more than just rice. An important point to remember is that rice is only about 25% of the diet for most people through the early modern period. And, of course, if you're an aristocrat, you're eating more rice. If you're a peasant, you're eating less rice. It really depends on your social status. Cooking technology. So initially, how are all these grains being prepared? Well, a very simple way to prepare grains is with a rice steamer. And actually, you don't even need a steamer. You can get a cloth bag and you put your rice into it and you wet the bag and you bury it in the ground. Um, but first build a fire over it. And so there's some sort of steaming that goes on and then cover it up. And after a while, you can unbury it. And lo and behold, you will have steamed rice. Now, the rice that works best for this is glutinous rice. And so traditionally, it's glutinous rice that's steamed. And who wants to bury a bag in the ground? It's much more effective to use a steamer. And so this gentleman over here is holding a rice steamer. It looks like a flower pot with holes at the bottom. Uh, that's the device that's used for steaming rice and steaming glutinous rice. That arrives in the Colossal Tomb period around the 4th century. After that, cooking pots are used for rice in the Han period, and there you get rice porridges being developed. By the early modern period, the premier way of cooking is to use a stove, and that's called a kamado. And you put a rice steamer on there called a kama. And interesting enough, this picture here is from the 1960s. So people are using this technology today. And indeed, in some sushi shops in Japan, you might see a rice pot like this because it's excellent. It's not just for boiling the rice. It both boils it and steams it. You see the edge around the pot. You fill the rice and the water up to that point, and then the rest of it is filled with steam. And so it produces the rice like a modern rice cooker. And in fact, a modern rice cooker was created to emulate a kama. So, what are the ways of obtaining food in various periods? One of the characteristics of the Jomon period is that it's a hunter, fishing, gathering society. In other words, people didn't grow stuff. Well, okay, I have to qualify that immediately by saying perhaps they brought together um, nut trees and things like that. There might have been some sort of agriculture in the Jomon period, but really, rice agriculture marks the beginning of the Yayoi period, or Yayoi marks the beginning of rice agriculture with wet paddy rice agriculture introduced sometime in the second or first millennia BCE. Besides that, there's bronze and iron that are introduced in the Yayoi. But hey, gathering foods, fishing, hunting, those remain very important in the Yayoi. Yayoi is a much more sophisticated society. There are defenses. People grow food and they want to defend it from their neighbors who might take it. Colossal Tomb period, that's when you see the arrival of rice steamers and a more sophisticated society. If you look up something about the colossal tombs, you'll know that you must have had a more sophisticated society to be able to construct these massive tombs. In the ancient periods, well, covering Nara and Heian, that's when chopsticks arrive. That's when banqueting cuisine develops for the Heian elites. That's when hunting and gathering become a little more problematic. In the Nara period, the state comes to view hunting as sometimes the antithesis of good agriculture. And so there are prohibitions against eating certain types of meat. So, cows and horses, that sort of meat, or fishing at certain times of year. And on the books, you know, Han aristocrats uh, did not eat a lot of meat. But off the books, what they're doing in their private life, what they're not recording, they're involved in hunting. So they're probably hunting wild deer and eating that, hunting wild boar and eating that. So there's a sort of the two levels here. There's what the written sources say, and then what people do in daily life. And certainly, if you're a samurai, you're going to be involved in hunting. So food rituals develop in the ancient period. I think we're going to talk about those. Uh, some of them are a lot of them are seasonal rituals. So, for example, here is a New Year's mirror cake, and this is a tradition that dates back to the ancient period of eating a rice cake as a way to improve your health. The Han aristocrats ate a teeth strengthening rice cake around the New Year's time because they saw association between having healthy teeth and longevity. And rice cakes are very auspicious foods because basically they're a pain to make. You have to make white rice that involves milling the rice in a hand mortar, kind of like what these rabbits are doing here, and then steaming it and then making a rice cake, which was actually what the rabbits are doing. You would use that mortar both to mill the rice and then to pound the rice cake. So the rice cake, it's a luxury food. You don't have it every day. And so you have it for special occasions, and such as the New Year's. And this is some practice that developed in the medieval period of making New Year's rice cakes and then putting them in the family shrine or important symbolic locations around the home as an offering to the deities. And this would sit there for a week's time or so before the family would take it and consume it. And after it's been offered to the deities, the rice cake takes on a certain magic power thanks to the deities. And so when you consume it, you earn the blessings of it. And what about its symbolic meanings? It's very symbolic important, very, very symbolically rich. A rice cake can be stretched, so that signifies longevity. A rice cake can symbolize the moon, as this image shows. Also on the New Year's rice cakes, there's an orange or a citron, rather. Excuse me. It's a type of orange, type of tangerine. What's called a dai in Japanese, and that refers to generation. It's a metaphor for the generations. Literally, that's the literal word for dai. So it's something that speaks to family continuity. We also see some dried persimmons there, and that speaks to marital harmony. So it's really a symbol that's been created here and then enshrined in an alcove. And so we can see through ritual, food takes on larger meanings, larger symbolic meanings, cosmological, religious meanings. Here's some more seasonal rice cakes. Another New Year's cake is a flower petal rice cake. And this is like a Japanese taco. and there's a white rice cake with a red rice cake inside, and they symbolize male and female. That's a burdock root that's poking through them. So it's a union of yin and yang, very auspicious sweet. There's lots of seasonal sweets too. For example, on the fifth day of the fifth month, that's Children's Day today, originally was Boys' Day, and you'd have an oak leaf sweet rice cake. Why? Because oak leaves stay on the tree until new leaves emerge. And that's a sign of strength and continuity. I guess those are the qualities you want to impart on young men, young boys. Then also sort of seasonal references with Japanese rice cakes and sweets. And here's a wonderful one for the springtime, a cherry leaf rice cake. So they invoke not just cosmological things, but seasonal moments. Let's move on to the medieval period then and think broadly about what's happening in those periods in terms of food. Uh, there are three historical periods that are part of the medieval period. There's the Kamakura, the Muromachi, and the Warring States. And Warring States, as you can see, is part of the Muromachi period, the latter part of it. Here we have the rise of the samurai. We have improvements in agriculture and the development of monastic foods through Zen Buddhism. Here we have Jufukaji Temple in Kamakura, which was Japan's first Zen temple. So, right around the year 1200, we have the rise of the samurai, and we have peasants. What are they eating, and how are they different from one another? First, let me say something about the samurai. There are only about 5,000, 6,000 samurai in this period, and 99 or 95, 95, 90% of the population are peasants. And samurai also, most of them living in rural areas. Samurai are, believe it or not, farmers. They're working on estates, involved in agriculture, overseeing agriculture, defending those lands, submitting tribute to people that they need to pay off for those lands. So they're living on the land. So there's a great deal of continuity between the peasant diet and the samurai diet. Although if you're a samurai and you're more of an overlord type, you're going to be eating a little bit better. You're going to be eating 3 times a day, and if you're a peasant, you're going to be eating 5 times a day. I'm always laughing at people who think that uh, folks didn't have a lunch until the 17th century, which is absolutely ridiculous. Yes, there might have been some aristocrats, some monks that ate 2 times a day, but if you're farming, you can't subsist on just 2 meals a day. We have records of farmers in the early part of the 20th century eating 5 or more meals a day. And so why wouldn't people back in the medieval period be eating that much too? 3 or 5 meals a day. I think that they were. If you're a peasant, you're going to be eating mostly barley, meat, maybe a little brown rice in your pot. Besides that, you'll have a vegetable soup. Pickles are an important part of the diet because it's a way to preserve vegetables year round. And you're going to be gathering foods. You're going to continue to go off into the woods and get your acorns, get your horse chestnuts, get your wild herbs, and take those home and preserve them. So you have those foodstuffs as well. So if you look at the samurai diet, it's pretty much similar, except they're probably going to be eating more brown rice. Maybe their soups are better. Maybe their pickles are better. And of course, samurai have horses and they have weapons. They go off and hunting deer, hunting boars, part of their military training, and they're going to be eating those things, regardless of any sort of prohibitions that you're not supposed to eat meat. They'll be consuming them. And for that matter, so will the peasantry. If you're a hungry peasant and a badger comes walking into your village, you're not going to say to yourself, "Oh, gee, I'm a Buddhist. I'm not going to eat that thing." No, you're gonna knock it on the head, and you're going to eat that uh, badger or possum or whatever it is, and probably enjoy it. There are some developments through Buddhism in the medieval period with the arrival of some monastic foodstuffs. And today, when we think of Zen cuisine, if we have the opportunity to go to a temple in Kyoto and eat the Zen cooking or the Buddhist cooking, we might have something like this ceremonial meal on the left, which is gourmet and lovely. But if you're living in the medieval period and you're a monk, you're not going to be eating ceremonial meals like that. You're going to be eating porridge. You are probably going to be eating, just twice a day. And that porridge will be augmented with a soup and pickles. But there are some foods that take off in the medieval period through the continent, from the continent, and they're introduced through Buddhist monasteries. Tofu is one of them. Um, First references to tofu in Japan date to the 12th century. And then we have the arrival of what we can call Chinese snacks. So noodle dishes, stuffed buns, or what the Japanese call manju. Originally, these were sort of vegetarian substitutes for meat, but later on, when sugar is introduced in the 16th century, they become sweets. So why do you need these snacks? Because heck, you're only eating twice a day and you get hungry. And so that's when it's nice to have a bowl of noodles or a stuffed bun of some sort. And these practices start off in the monasteries, but then they spread to the rest of society. Here are some examples of these Buddhist snack foods. So wheat noodles, as I said earlier, stone mortars arrive in the medieval period and it makes it possible to mill uh, wheat. Once you make flour, you can make noodles and have wheat noodles or buckwheat noodles. There's ryokan, which was today it's a sweet, but actually it was a vegetarian substitute for meat back in the medieval period. And then stuffed buns. Today, again, it's a sweet stuffed with azuki beans, made with azuki beans like ryokan, but in the medieval period, it was probably going to be stuffed with vegetables or something else, or the ryokan, the azuki rather, would not be sweetened, so it would be a savory dish. We get the development of cuisine in the 15th century, and this is something that develops for the warrior class. Historians call it main tray cuisine. And that's a reference to the main tray, which is placed in front of the guest. And the main tray has rice on the left side. This is a custom that developed in the Kamakura period of always having rice on the left side. Why? Because then you can pick it up with your hands and rest the rice bowl on your hands and then use your right hand to eat it with. And if you're left-handed, well, tough luck. You have to learn to eat this way. So the rice is always on the left side. There's always a soup. There's always pickles, and then there's always a sashimi, or what we have in the top left corner of the main tray here is namasu, which is kind of a seafood or vegetable salad, and that's another. You always have to have that on a main tray dish. But it's not just the main tray. There are other trays as well. And depending on your status, if you're a shogun, you could expect to have 5 trays, as in this example, or maybe 7 trays if people are really pulling out the stops for you. So all of this food is served at the same time. And the trays in front all have a soup. They all have side dishes. Um, if you can read Japanese, you'll notice that one of these trays, the one in the top right, is not called the fourth tray because four is bad luck. Four is associated with death because it's a homonym for the word for death, which is a lot of times, which is the reason why if you go to a Japanese hospital, there's never a fourth floor because who wants to stay on the death floor in the hospital? Instead, this is called an additional tray, and that usually had grilled foods. And then we have a 5th tray too. And sometimes there'd be even more foods that are put in dishes around the floor. So multiple trays of food served simultaneously. It's too much, really. And people love that. And a lot of these dishes that were served were not meant to be eaten. They're just for decoration or just for this symbolic value. And we'll see some examples of those, I think, a little bit later on. Here again is the structure of the Honzen banquet, the main tray cuisine. Each tray has a soup and then various side dishes. And the way a banquet would work is typically there's a drinking ceremony that takes place, a sake drinking ceremony between the host and the main guest. I'll talk about that in later lectures. And then that's a very formal occasion. It's a time for sort of bonding between the host and the guest, and it's time for the host to get to give lots of gifts to the guests, and chance for them also to drink a lot of sake on an empty stomach. And so they go from this very, very formal moments in the drinking ceremony to the banquet, which is a little more relaxed. And then banquet goes on, there's entertainments, and typically hours later, people get hungry again. And so they call for something called the after banquet, in which noodles are served and other foods. So banquets, in other words, are not just an hour events. These banquets go on all day and all night. And who attends these banquets? But the warrior elite, so the shogun and high-ranking warlords, and then also members of the aristocracy. People in the countryside, ordinary folk, they don't start eating this way until the early modern period. And indeed, this cuisine only survives in rural areas today in Japan. So I said that I mentioned some inedible dishes that are just for display. Well, here are two from a wonderful picture scroll from Mankamero restaurants in Kyoto. Let's begin with the one on the right. This was a dish that was served for the emperor in the early 17th century. Snipe in eggplant. Yes, you can see the little snipe heads poking out of the eggplant. This, thankfully, is a purely decorative dish. This would be brought in front of the emperor among many other dishes, and the emperor would pick up his chopsticks and then tong tong hit the tray, and the food would be whisked away. So it's meant to delight the eye. And the similar thing is going on for this display of rice cakes for the Ohagatame ritual. This was the ritual of the teeth strengthening rice cakes, which is the basis for the New Year's rice cakes that I showed earlier. Here we have an elaborate tray meant to represent an island of the immortals. And on that tray are two birds. Those are likely to be birds that have been cooked, but their feathers have been reattached to make them lifelike. You don't eat that. It's purely decorative. And there's some other decorative foodstuffs there. So these are meant to delight the eye. They're meant to call up on mythology and references to religion. The tray itself represents the island of the immortals, someplace in the ocean where the immortal sages dwell. All sorts of auspicious meanings. Perhaps too, the fowl that are appearing on that tray were taken in the hunt by a lord, and that speaks to that lord's prowess in falconry. Lots of symbolic levels that one could read, but you wouldn't need it. Moving on, one of the entertainments you might see at a banquet, these long banquets, are cutting rituals, which are called shikibocho or hocho shiki. Hocho being a knife, and shiki being ritual. And the persons who do this are hochonin. They're really the professional chefs for the military elites in the medieval period. They're the ones who create these elaborate banquets, and they're the ones who also do these banquet entertainments called cutting rituals. And typically what happens is a large cutting board is brought out. This cutting board has legs, And the master of the cutting knife will prepare a fish or a bird and transform that bird or fish into a sculpture that's not meant to be consumed, but just meant to be consumed visually. It's like flower arrangement with food. And the trick of this is that the master of the knife can only use their knife and these long metal chopsticks to do this. They can't touch the fish or the bird. And also there's a moment in this ritual when the spirit of the creature is liberated. So if you are worried about the Buddhist implications of taking life, you don't have to worry because the fish or the bird has gone on to a better existence before, it's cut up this way. You don't have a chance to see this often in Japan. Sometimes at shrine rituals. It's a rarity today, but there are still some practitioners. And actually, the Mankamiro that I mentioned earlier, the owner of that is the head of one of these schools of Shikibocho. Food writings debut in the early modern period. So the people who are creating, excuse me, in the medieval period. In the medieval period, we have culinary writings that debut. So the people who are creating these elaborate banquets and that are doing these knife ceremonies are writing down their secrets. And there are secret manuscripts initially. In other words, they're ones that are just kept between small circle of folks. And that was pretty typical of the period. Every art form needed its secret writings. So whether that's theater or flower arrangement or food, and those start appearing in the 15th century. In the early modern period, a lot of these get published. And so it's through publishing them that these ideas, these notions about food become more widespread. And you could say that that's essential to the development of a wider understanding of cuisine as more people have understanding and access to these traditions, and they can figure out what's going on, or they can start to emulate it and they can do it themselves in the early modern period. And here's one example of a culinary text that dates to the early 17th century by associated with the Shijo school, which is another school of ceremonial cutting and banquet creation. Going to wrap up here by also saying something about etiquette, because that becomes important in the medieval period. In other words, good manners. And what was good manners in the medieval period and the early modern period is still good manners today. So these are all important points for us to take away. If you're going to take away one thing, you might learn how to eat politely from this lecture. These notes come from the writings of Issei Sadatake, who was from the 18th century and part of the Issei family, who were had a long tradition of being specialists in etiquette. So Issei Sadatake knew what he's talking about. And Issei Sadatake in the 18th century said, if you're trying to be a polite banqueter, if you're at a multi-tray banquet, you don't go soup to soup. And what he meant by that was you don't drink one soup and then go to another tray and drink another soup. In other words, if you have a soup, you should then have a side dish or have some rice. And the same was true about side dishes. You don't want to go from one side dish to another. You do a side dish and a soup or a side dish and rice, and you kind of alternate. Um, Maybe that's not so important today, but maybe today we're not served so many soups at once. We are served a lot of side dishes, but it's a good memory. It's a good, I guess, pointer for us to remember to eat some rice. He also outlined some faux pas with chopsticks, and these are very important today. And I have some chopsticks to illustrate. Hopefully, there'll be some clarity about these chopsticks. You can see what I'm doing with these chopsticks. I hope so. If not, you can just imagine mistakes with chopsticks. First of all, pulling. And what's referred to there is if you pull a plate with your chopsticks, that's a no-no. You don't pull your plate or pull a common plate, especially with chopsticks. Just use your hand. Pick it up. Don't be lazy. Pointing with chopsticks. You see a lot of this in Japanese theater. traditional theater like Rakugo, someone will have a fan and they're supposed to indicate chopsticks and they point with it. That's bad. Why? Because those chopsticks have been in your mouth and you're spraying your spittle everywhere. Likewise, sucking on your chopsticks, that's bad for obvious reasons. Even if you have a little bit of rice on your chopsticks, don't like suck at it like a corn cob. Forcing food in your mouth with chopsticks, again, not only bad etiquette, but also potentially dangerous if you're shoving too much food in your mouth. Hovering and digging. Hovering and digging refer to, well, if you're sharing a common plate of food with someone and you take your chopsticks and you have that over the plate and you say, oh, what am I going to have? And you kind of go back and forth, hovering over the plate. Again, that's gross because those things have been in your mouth. Far better, instead of serving yourself with your own chopsticks, is to take the chopsticks that are provided to serve yourself with, or if there's no chopsticks provided, you turn your chopsticks around and use your end of your chopsticks to serve food. And you don't have them hovering above the plates. Decide before you go in there what you want. And likewise, it's bad form to be digging in a common plate for that shrimp that you want or that quail egg that you want. You know it's at the bottom. You want to find it. No, that's very rude. Symbolically, trading and planting have to do with funerary rituals, and that's taking your chopsticks and planting them in your rice, and like so they're upright. That's very bad mojo because that happens if the food is offered to the deceased. And so by doing that at a meal, it's basically like you're giving your food to the ghosts, and it might attract ghosts. I didn't believe this myself. I went to a Japanese restaurant when I first went to Japan and I did it, which I do not recommend. And the waitress got very upset with me. So I learned that it's, in fact, a true thing. Don't put your chopsticks in your rice like this. Put them off to the side, or maybe there's a chopstick rest that you can use. So don't plant the chopsticks in your rice. Trading refers to taking your chopsticks with maybe some food on it or something, and then giving it to a companion who also has the chopsticks. So, in other words, passing your food to them, you both of you using chopsticks. That's bad. I mean, not only there sanitary things for that, but it also evokes a moment in a Japanese funeral after the corpse is cremated. In the United States, when corpses are cremated, the bones are ground up to a consistency of kitty litter. But in Japan, the bones aren't cooked that much and they're not ground. And so, as part of the funeral ceremony, the family will gather and then take those bones and put them one by one, each member of the family or the friends, sharing chopsticks to do this. So, in other words, two people picking up a bone with metal chopsticks and putting it inside a funerary urn. Now, that can be very moving. I've done it before and it was very, very moving. Um, but it's not something you want to think about when you're having lunch. So, don't do that. So, these really important points of etiquette developed in the medieval period. They became more widespread in the early modern period thanks to the spread of cuisine through publication. The medium of print takes off in the 17th century, which is how a lot of culinary knowledge gets spread to the general public is through printed books. And today these rules remain true. So keep that in mind next time you're trying to impress a guest or trying not to look like an oaf when you eat Japanese food. These are important points of etiquette. Well, I hope you got something out of this lecture. This next lecture will cover food in early modern Japan, and I look forward to you joining with me then. If you have questions about the lecture, please do contact me, and be glad to respond to you. Thank you very much. Bye bye.